Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Ricardo Reis and I'm the director of the Program for Economic Research, which has organized this event. And we're very happy today to have as the speaker Professor Richard Clarida. Rich is the Lowell Harris Professor of Economics at the Economics Department and International Affairs at the School of International and Public Affairs here at Columbia. And he has been here with us, luckily for us, for now more than 25 years, since 1988. Rich, I think this is Rich's only academic job, in that I think he's been with us almost from the beginning of his PhD, but he has had many other interesting jobs insofar as he has served, as you see there, as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. He has served in the Reagan administration, and he is a frequent advisor to a series of financial firms working in financial markets, most recently with PIMCO. Rich is an extremely popular lecturer and professor who has trained many generations of Columbia PhDs and undergraduates, and we're very, very glad that aside from his usual already heavy teaching load, which he always takes with great pride and a big smile, he also would come and talk to us here about a more of a current events and yet historical topic in terms of thinking about the links between the work of Hamilton and current policy events at this fall's event. So thank you everyone for coming, and I give the floor to Rich Clarida.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for coming out, because the weather's nice, so that's a temptation, and we also have World Leaders Forum, so I'm competing against the Prime Minister of Japan, who's only trying to save the third largest economy in the world. So I appreciate your exhibiting revealed preference and your interest in Hamilton. Let me give a little bit of background about how this talk came about, and so you can sort of, there's an old saying, you know, where you stand depends on where you sit, so you sort of see where I come at this subject. So I live in Connecticut in a little community called Southport, which has a wonderful library. And about a year ago, the librarian called me up and said that the library was getting a traveling exhibition of some Alexander Hamilton historical objects. And they thought that given that I had taught at Columbia and that I've been at Treasury, I've got to be a leading Hamilton expert, so could I come down and give some thoughts on that? And I said, well, I'm not a Hamilton expert, but I'll accept the invitation, and it will, you know, encourage me to learn more about Alexander Hamilton. And so that's where this is coming from. I'm going to begin with some overview about Hamilton more broadly, and then move it well into the 21st century. Let me begin with three quotes. I could have 3,000 quotes, but none of these gentlemen is a slouch. They've all been president. Roosevelt, Hamilton, the most brilliant American statesman ever lived. A lot of competition there. Jefferson, Hamilton, a colossus, a host unto himself. We can pay off his debt. We can never get rid of his financial system. And then Barack Obama. Jefferson was not entirely wrong to fear Hamilton's vision. We've always been a country balancing between self-interest and community, market and democracy, concentration of wealth and power, and the opening up of opportunity. So obviously, you know, on a grading scale, where does Hamilton come out? I'm going to sort of give my punchline. I think at least a 10 out of 10. If you've seen the movie This Is Spinal Tap, he would be an 11 out of a scale of 10. So I'm going to try to persuade you that that Hamilton, and obviously his face is on the $10 bill too, so also appropriate. Let me talk a little bit about Hamilton. If you go through the standard biography, you'll see that he's a founding father of our country, a constitutional scholar, something I didn't know or I'd forgotten, a Revolutionary War hero, fought courageously in some of the key battles of the Revolutionary War, distinguished member of Congress, trustee of Columbia University, leader of the nation's first political party, the Federalists, Treasury Secretary, a financial titan and founder of the first Bank of the United States, the predecessor to the Fed, as well as the Bank of New York, I think the second oldest bank in the United States, still operating, still thriving. His portrait, as we've seen, graces the $10 bill, unless we forget also the masthead of the New York Post, the newspaper he founded in 1801 that's still with us. And remarkable accomplishments, if you look at this list, we could be describing the accomplishments of a dozen people, but it's obviously one person, which is Alexander Hamilton. Now, Hamilton did all this in less than 50 years. He died at the age of 49, as we all know, in a duel with Aaron Burr. He was born in 1755, quote, the bastard brat of a Scotch peddler. Those are the words of John Adams, his contemporary and rival. And he was raised in the bustling but very remote British West Indies. He was orphaned at age 11, but he did benefit from the support of some mentors in the West Indies. And at age 12, he was essentially running an import-export business. And we know that because he kept very detailed records. Through the support of these mentors in the West Indies, they gave him some money so he could go to college in New York to attend what was then called King's College, obviously today Columbia, and he never looked back. And so if you read what is really the definitive biography of Hamilton, which is by Ron Chernow, which is 900 pages long, but an incredibly gripping account. So what really followed was a historic personal journey that really, without any question, profoundly shaped formative, precarious first years of our country, and with consequences that to this day influence our lives and our government and our financial markets. So in his early 20s, Hamilton was George Washington's chief of staff. So we're not talking about some grunt somewhere. Washington recognized this talent when he was 20. He was named Washington's chief of staff. And he organized the Revolutionary War Army and indeed served bravely under Washington at the Battle of Yorktown. Indeed, there was tension, as you learn, between Hamilton and Washington. Hamilton did not want to be chief of staff. He actually wanted to be in the field fighting, and Washington could not risk losing him. And so only at the very end of the war did Hamilton extricate himself by managing to get himself fired by Washington and then appointed to serve and serve heroically in the Battle of Yorktown. By the time he was 30, he was probably the country's most accomplished lawyer with a thriving law practice here in New York. And in his free time, he was the author of most of the Federalist Papers, and thus he was also really the country's leading constitutional scholar. Before he turned 40, he had served as Washington's first Treasury Secretary and really, in effect, the de facto prime minister of the U.S., because as you learn from these accounts, Washington was very hands-off in the day-to-day, and that became Hamilton's day-to-day assignment, much to Jefferson's displeasure. And he really forged, without any question, the modern financial and economic system that we take for granted today. David Brooks has noted that, quote, Alexander Hamilton was the most progressive and in some ways the most neglected of our founding fathers. He was the most progressive because he saw that America could be a capitalist superpower, and he figured out which institutions it would need to realize that destiny. He's the most neglected because he was a relentless climber, because he was a great champion of commerce, and because his most bitter rivals, Jefferson and Adams, outlived him by decades and did everything in their lifetime to bury his reputation. So as Brooks has said, there is no Hamilton monument in Washington, but he also reminds us, if you seek Hamilton's monument, look around you. You're living in it. We honor Jefferson, but we live in Hamilton's country, an industrial nation with a strong central government. So this talk is entitled From Washington to Wall Street, What Would Hamilton Think? And of course, a daunting, please come on in. You're welcome. Please come in. Haven't missed anything. Yeah. A daunting question, certainly, for anyone standing here in 2014 to have any particular insight on. But with your indulgence, I'm going to give it a go and try to draw on my experience here at Columbia as a professor focusing on macro and monetary matters and my time at the Treasury. So I'm going to begin this talk with a selective review of some major economic and financial trends that today we take for granted, but that would certainly have astonished or perhaps in some cases angered Alexander Hamilton, were he back today at the Treasury Department. And then I'm going to offer my perspectives on the current state of the global economy, in particular talk a lot about the Fed's monetary policy, talk about the fiscal stalemate in Washington. And then I'm going to offer some observations on what Hamilton just might think about three of the major issues that are front and center today in global policy discussions. International trade, trade negotiations, the crisis in the Eurozone, and the polarization of the political system. And then I'll be happy to take questions at the end. So now if we look at some important economic and financial trends of the past 200 years, it's safe to say that Alexander Hamilton would have a range of emotions were he with us today to account for himself. And I'd like to suggest, and I'll show you some charts, that Hamilton might be variously described as impressed, as dazzled, in some cases appalled. He would be perplexed, no doubt. He'd be surprised and he'd be amazed, and I think at the end he'd be very optimistic. But there would be a range of emotions. So lots happened in 200 years. So here's a very, very quick history of the last 200 years' financial history. So I think Hamilton would be impressed if you look at this chart of per capita GDP. As the economists in the room know, it's virtually impossible to do an accurate inflation adjustment for the consumption basket in 1790, but people try, and if you do those calculations, you get this logarithmic plot of per capita GDP in 1790. So you think of Hamilton, this country's just gone through an incredibly debilitating revolutionary war, huge stock of debt, no real set of institutions, and concerns about being a viable economy. And so obviously Hamilton, I think, would be impressed with all that. I think Hamilton would be dazzled when you look at the explosion in technological innovation since his time. So essentially everything on this chart basically did not exist in Hamilton's day. And this has all obviously been progressing. This is some relationship between innovation and years to adoption. So the interesting thing is it took something like 120 years for railways to be adopted in 90% of the countries widely, and we're now at the internet in about 10 years. But I think Hamilton would be appalled if he looked at the stock of government debt in the United States. One of Hamilton's signal accomplishments and issues was Washington and he inherited a country with a lot of debt because they essentially assumed the debts of the states, and that was one of the bargains required to get the country going. It seemed like a lot of debt at the time, but some percentage of GDP, and Hamilton became committed to paying it down. And obviously, as the economists in the room know, most of the debt the U.S. historically has accumulated has been in wartime. That's evident from the chart. More recently, first in the 1980s and then subsequently with the Great Recession, we've accumulated a lot of debt outside of wartime. And that would be something that in Hamilton's day, not just in the U.S., but globally, was just unheard of, was huge stocks of sovereign debt that aren't used to pay off bills from war. I think Hamilton would be perplexed. In Hamilton's day, money was tied to a commodity, silver or gold. Hamilton was around for the Silver Coinage Act of 1792 that defined a dollar as essentially its weight in gold. So 1 ounce of silver was approximately $1.15. And obviously that was very steady until the Civil War, and then obviously the Civil War was inflationary, and then you see obviously the explosion in the silver price as the U.S. moved away from the Bretton Woods system into a fiat money system. So Hamilton wouldn't understand this because fiat money systems basically were not understood or appreciated or thought to be viable in those days, and that's obviously the world is on that system. I think he'd be very surprised at this chart. So you would tell Hamilton that we've got all this government debt, unrelated to wartime. You would tell Hamilton that we have all this inflation in the dollar price of silver, and you'd say bond yields are much lower now than when you were Treasury Secretary. So I think he'd be surprised at that observation. And of course, in those days, since inflation is zero, then real interest rates are very high, roughly 5, 6, 7%, and today they're negative. So he'd be very surprised at that. I think he'd be amazed at the stock market. The early stock market in the U.S. in New York City was something that was supported by the Bank of New York, which Hamilton founded. Hamilton thought the U.S. should have a market. He was really focused more on banking than a stock market, but nonetheless. And obviously the surge in the stock market has coincided with the surge in the economy. And then in the end, I think Hamilton would be optimistic. So I can't get this chart going back to 1790, but given the scale, it wouldn't matter. All these numbers would be close to zero. This is basically the nominal value of global GDP in the last 50 or 60 years, and obviously really on the road to a $100 trillion global economy, which would have just been incredibly shocking to Hamilton in his day. And so I think Hamilton would be optimistic. He'd also be surprised that, yeah, the U.S. is a big player. That probably would be part of that. But then you've got China, obviously, and the rest of the world. So this is not just limited to one country. So that's a quick tour of financial history in 6 minutes. So now we've sort of set the stage between the world of Hamilton's day and where we are today. Okay, but obviously something's happened on the way to that $100 trillion global economy. So let's talk about the financial crisis and talk about the exit from it and what it's meant for policy, both monetary and fiscal. So obviously we had a great global recession in 2008 and 9. It was the worst recession globally since the Great Depression. You see the year-over-year collapse in GDP. And it was a global recession with all parts of the world suffering. Not only a great global recession, but thus far a very disappointing substandard global recovery. This is data from the IMF. So if you look at the depth of the recession compared to prior global recessions, you'll see how deep it was. But you'll also see the recovery has been quite modest, especially in the last three years. So we've had a deep recession, but we have had a very substandard recovery. So why a deep recession, a disappointing recovery? I think one thing economics helps us to understand, and one thing the record confirms, is it is really not, even though it's tempting and probably part of human nature, it's really not very informative to look for one cause of why we had this great recession and disappointing recovery. I think there are several factors. I'll mention 4. One is that in some countries, including the U.S. and elsewhere, there was a 25-year period before the Great Recession in which there was an enormous levering up of the private sector. So it's what I and others have called the Great Leveraging. So during this period, what macroeconomists tend to focus on is how stable nominal GDP growth was. And especially after Paul Volcker defeated inflation, how low and stable inflation was. And this period was called the Great Moderation. But coincident with the Great Moderation was something else, which is the great levering up of the U.S. economy. So what I plotted here is Fed data on the leverage of the non-financial private sector. So this is households and companies, corporations. It excludes the banks because bank leverage is funny because they got a lot of assets, and it excludes the federal government. So this is the private sector levering up. I was lucky enough as a graduate student studying at Harvard in the early 80s to work with Benjamin Friedman, a professor there. And in those days, one of the things that Ben was working on was this idea that the economics profession was focused too much on the monetary aggregates, and that was the heyday of monetarism in the late 70s. And Ben argued that as both a theoretical and a practical matter, we should actually be monitoring credit creation in the U.S. economy. And indeed, Ben did some work, and I was the RA for it, that showed, if anything, the relationship between credit and economic activity was more reliable than money and economic activity. What was interesting is that in the period from the Korean War to the mid-1980s, there was essentially no levering up of the U.S. economy. As nominal GDP grew, then so did private sector debt, and so the leverage ratio was unchanged. And that's a quite remarkable stable relationship. It survived several wars, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the end of Bretton Woods, the Great Inflation. That was a very, very stable ratio, of course, until it wasn't. And then by the late 80s and early 90s, we began to have this explosion in credit. And for the most part, it was more or less off the radar screen of mainstream macroeconomics, and I include myself in this category. We were ignoring that leverage for a variety of reasons I won't bore you with. A lot of this leverage was actually occurring outside of the traditional financial system. It was occurring in what's called the shadow banking system. So the Fed didn't really worry about it because the Fed gets paid to worry about banks, and if banks aren't doing the lending, but it's occurring outside of the banking system, then the Fed wasn't watching. As I said, most but not all academics were ignoring it, in part because of something called the Modigliani-Miller theorem, which says in certain cases it's irrelevant. But also, debt service was apparently not a problem for households, because if this debt was going up, interest rates were falling, for all these reasons, this was off the radar screen until it got on the radar screen. So clearly the levering up of the U.S. economy, and we focus on housing, but it wasn't just housing, was, in retrospect, made the economy more fragile. And there were many of us, myself included, who thought because of securitization it made the economy more stable. A couple of folks, Raghu Rajan, who's now running Indian monetary policy, were talking about this in the middle part of the last decade, but not very many. Now, another reason we had a deep global recession at this point in the recovery is that in Europe, during the Great Moderation period, is that the euro was created. So we had the creation of the euro. And as a consequence, borrowing costs in Europe plummeted. And as a result, Greece could borrow money for 10 years at rates comparable to Germany. Indeed, I believe in 2005, which was an Olympic year for Greece, they were able to borrow money in the sovereign market at a 10-year horizon for 5 basis points, that is 0.0005 over the cost of Germany borrowing. So, and one of the experts in this is Ricardo right here, so I won't go into this too much other than to say that when interest rates are low and countries can borrow, they do, and they accumulate debt, and that's okay until you get into a situation like the euro crisis when these borrowing costs explode. So in addition to a global financial crisis, which began in 2008, there was also a Eurozone crisis that began in 2010, and that only now appears to be moving into the rearview mirror. The third factor that I think contributed to the great global financial crisis and the severity of the recession was the financial system was much more fragile than anyone thought. Alan Greenspan, Ben Bernanke, myself, any academics who are working on this. And it turned out that especially in the U.S., the shadow banking system, so this credit intermediation channel that's outside of the traditional banking system, was not only incredibly large, but it was incredibly interconnected, and so long as every connection was working fine, it appeared very safe and sound and boring. But as soon as it became tested, you talk about the weakest link in the chain, there were probably 300 or 400 weak links in this chain. And as these weak links began to snap, the whole system froze up, and that really led to was coincident with the great financial crisis and led to the Fed to essentially get involved in making the Fed's balance sheet substitute for the collapse of the shadow banking system, which is what we got in 2008, 9, and 10. I'm going to take questions at the end, but I'm happy to do that. Happy to do that then. Now, this diagram has an interesting history in and of itself. This is a diagram that was put together by a working group within the New York Fed in 2010. And it came about as they were working on a white paper, an internal white paper for the New York Fed, which was trying to understand the proximate causes of the financial crisis and the repercussions from it. And they realized at the New York Fed that they actually didn't understand all these nodes and connections, and so they actually made it as a challenge for themselves to do this circuit diagram of the shadow banking system. And so this is what they came up with, but 2 years after the crisis. So this didn't even exist. If you will, this wiring diagram for the financial system did not even exist in Washington or in the New York Fed before the crisis. So we had this elaborate system that had evolved, but no real understanding of how it worked until it collapsed. Now, I think another factor is that the global economy before the crisis became very, very dependent on one particular growth model. And that growth model had to square the fact that you had this buoyant increase in aggregate supply from the emerging economies, and not just China. And we know in Econ 101, if you've got an increase in supply, then something has to adjust to lead to an increase in demand, so demand equals supply. And it turned out that the countries that were adding to supply were also countries that were growing rapidly and saving a lot. And so if you have a big increase in supply and you have a big increase in saving, then, as my class and other classes teach, globally you've got to have a big increase in investment to sop up that saving. So what is going to occur in terms of the price mechanism to equate saving and investment, supply and demand, the decline in global interest rates and risk premium, and this is Bernanke's saving. So the world became dependent on these ever wider trade imbalances. And the trade imbalances, in turn, were sustained because interest rates globally fell, and those encouraged countries like the U.S. to import more than they exported and sustained the demand for countries that were exporting more than they were importing. So if you read various accounts of the crisis, you'll have entire books or libraries that are focused on this channel, the savings flow, and others that are focused on financial complexity, and others that are focused on the Eurozone crisis, and others that are focused on leveraging. But the fact is, all four of these were issues, and they all basically intersected in the summer of 2007, leading into the crisis in 2008. So we can speculate until another 200 years whether or not we would have had a global financial crisis if only one or two of these had been an issue. It turned out all four of them were an issue. So this is my take. So we got a policy response, both for monetary and fiscal policy. So in terms of fiscal policy, the global economy for a couple of years went Keynesian. We had a huge fiscal stimulus in the U.S. in 2009. You had fiscal stimulus in China. In fact, relative to the size of the economy, even bigger than ours. Other countries in Europe had not so much discretionary fiscal policy, but automatic stabilizers kicked in substantially. So you definitely had fiscal stimulus, but obviously that only lasted for a year or two, and most countries in the world have been doing some form of austerity since then. Talk a little bit about U.S. fiscal policy. We've reached some accommodation in Washington that I'll talk about later in terms of avoiding the fiscal cliff and avoiding defaulting on our debt. And I guess it's good that we didn't default on our debt or we avoided a fiscal cliff. But the fact is that relative to our longer-term fiscal challenges, say going out 10, 15, or 20 years, the U.S. really does not have a fiscal policy. We have a huge gulf that begins to open up in the early part of the next decade, driven by entitlements, Medicare, Social Security, and the demographic aging of the population. And essentially now, although you'll see talk occasionally of tax reform and getting a handle on this, it looks very clear to me at least that this will be at the earliest in the next president's administration, in the next Clinton administration, and it could well be to the 2020 before we deal with these issues. Inevitably we'll have to. The reason why the U.S. has some time, the reason why we can buy some time is because the dollar is still the global reserve currency. And as a result, the U.S. enjoys what has been called an exorbitant privilege, and one of the privileges is that you can put off making the tough decisions for 10 or 20 years, whereas in Greece they couldn't. They got forced into a decision. This is CBO numbers for the debt to GDP ratio. One of them is an optimistic scenario. This is basically, in technical terms, an extended baseline. It basically would allow tax increases to come into play and Medicare cuts to come into play. And then you have what they call the alternative fiscal policy, which is basically leaving everything that's currently in the code in place and not addressing it. And then you get this explosion in debt. Now, how is it that we have this explosion in debt globally, and yet the U.S. can borrow money for 10 years at a rate of 2.5%? I looked at my screen today. Not only Spain, Germany, France, Italy, but actually Slovenia can now borrow money for 10 years at a lower rate than the U.S. Those are euro-denominated, but still. So why hasn't the bond market noticed? Well, this is something that's been pointed out by a number of folks. There is still today, 5 years after the crisis, an appetite for assets that are deemed as safe. And relative to that demand, there's a scarcity of safe assets. If you define a safe asset as one that's ranked AAA, for example, then the share of fixed income rated AAA in terms of sovereigns has gone 68 to 52 and on the way down. And of course, one of the things about Wall Street alchemy in the years leading up to the crisis was Wall Street was able to create AAA securities out of non-guaranteed private structures which had a certain feature. They were known as tranche securitizations, and those carried AAA ratings too until they defaulted. And so there is a scarcity of safe assets, and that's one factor leading to these lower interest rates. So we had a fiscal policy response. We clearly also had a monetary policy response. initially, what did central banks do? They followed the textbook and they cut interest rates basically to close to zero. So this is the average interest rate in the U.S., Japan, the Eurozone, and the U.K. The problem, of course, with this strategy is once interest rates get close to zero, your ability to cut them lower is limited. Now, I should point out that zero is not a bound. We call the zero lower bound, but right now in the Eurozone, there are negative interest rates. So any bank that has excess reserves that wants to deposit them at the European Central Bank actually has to pay the European Central Bank to do that. And because of that, 2-year sovereign yields in Germany are now negative. So if you want to lend money to the German government, you pay the German government money to lend them money. But economists still talk about the zero lower bound, so I'm going to as well, but it's not quite zero. So what do you do if you've cut your policy rate close to zero and your economies are still in free fall? Well, then you go to Plan B, which is to balloon your balance sheet with quantitative easing. This chart's about a year out of date, so basically all these lines should keep going up. The only thing that's happened in the last year is Japan has belatedly gotten into the QE sweepstakes under the leadership of Mr. Clarida. So now, just as an aside, and now I'm going to be very professorial, all QE is not created equal. And in particular, there's a difference between the way the ECB's been doing it and the Fed and these other central banks. So when the Fed does QE, it actually buys a security from the private sector and it owns it. So it buys a mortgage-backed security or a bond. And when it buys that security, what it's doing is it's taking out of the market whatever risk is embedded in that security. So in the case of a 10-year Treasury, it's taking out interest rate risk that the market would have to hold. In the case of a mortgage, it's taking out some complex combination of interest rate risk and prepayment risk. And so by doing so, by taking those risk factors out of the market, it leads to a change in their price, and that leads to lower interest rates and lower spreads. There's some debate over whether or not QE works. I'm in the camp that thinks it does. We could talk about that during the question and answer session. The ECB, for a variety of reasons, has not done most of its QE in that fashion. What the ECB has done to date, and we'll talk about this during the Q&A, for the most part, the ECB's balance sheet is ballooned. Instead of buying the assets outright, what it's done is that it's lent a lot of money to commercial banks for them to go out and buy the assets. Now you might say, well, it doesn't matter. It's €1 trillion, whether or not the ECB buys them or banks buy them, same thing. Well, it's actually different. Here's the reason. So when the ECB does big-scale QE, and it's actually technically called long-term refinancing operation, the risk factor never leaves the market. That is, a private actor has to hold that security. It's merely the private actor, the bank in France or Spain or Italy that buys that government bond or that asset is getting lent money by the ECB on very favorable terms. So it is having an impact on the price, but that risk factor is not taken out of the market as it is with QE. Now, in the new ECB program that they've just announced, they are going to be buying assets, asset-backed securities, and they are going to be buying covered bonds, and they will be taking those out of the market, but there just aren't enough asset-backed securities and covered bonds to do a big €1 trillion or €2 trillion program. So at some point, if they want to do QE, they're going to have to go down the road the Fed has done, but that's a 2015 story. Okay, obviously in the Fed we did the same thing, just to show you that there is a logic to all of this. So the gold line is the actual Fed policy rate. The blue line is a particular benchmark for how the Fed should set policy. It's a version of what's called a Taylor rule. John Taylor, the eminent professor at Stanford. Those students, I see some students here from my class, they know what a Taylor rule is. There's a particular version of the Taylor rule that I like. It's called a forward-looking Taylor rule. So you basically do a benchmark for policy based upon expectations of future inflation, and also based importantly on expectations of what Taylor calls the neutral relative. That's an aside. But whether or not you use the jazzy forward-looking Taylor rule or John's original rule, they all say the same thing, which is in 2008, the Fed should have been cutting rates and basically cut them to zero. This is what QE looks like. In the U.S. So before the financial crisis, the Fed had a balance sheet with assets and liabilities like any bank. It has a balance sheet. But it may surprise people to know, given how important the Fed is, that the Fed's balance sheet, now $800 billion is a big number, but it's not as big as Citibank's balance sheet or Bank of America's balance sheet. So there are a lot of private banks that have a much bigger balance sheet. So the Fed was running monetary policy with a balance sheet of about $800 billion. And importantly, until Lehman Brothers, it was not expanding the balance sheet. So the Fed did a lot of jazzy things in this period from the summer of 07 until Lehman Brothers. But what it did is it basically lent money to security dealers and it lent money to JP Morgan to buy Bear Stearns, but it paid for that by selling treasuries. So it actually didn't balloon the balance sheet. And then Lehman Brothers happens and AIG happens and Fannie and Freddie get put into conservatorship, and it's at that point that the balance sheet begins to explode. And so the Fed's balance sheet has increased from about $800 billion to north of $4 trillion right now. And these other programs are all these things put in place during the crisis that have been wound down. So the Fed owns a lot of mortgages. It owns a lot of treasuries. Now, in terms of the mortgages, it's important to note that the Fed has stepped in part, out of necessity because Fannie and Freddie have been in conservatorship and they've been under a regime to wind down their so-called retained portfolios. So like it or not, the Fed is now the biggest player in the mortgage market. The Fed's holdings of mortgages are actually bigger than Fannie and Freddie's. And over the next 3 or 4 years, Fannie and Freddie's holdings of mortgages are going to shrink even further. One of the interesting things that we learned from the Fed meeting last week and from Janet Yellen's press conference is that much as many Fed members would like to be out of the mortgage business, they recognize now that for the foreseeable future, they're going to be in the mortgage business. And indeed, it was very revealing last week that when the Fed's exit principles were finally revealed, that they revealed that they may never sell any mortgages. And so since these are 30-year mortgages, the Fed's going to be holding some of these things until the year 2044. They don't like it, but they now know that the alternative, which is to sell $1.5 trillion of mortgages, might be more disruptive to the market than they would like. So they're basically saying now, we may sell them, but we may never sell them. And that's important to recognize. Now, another tool of policy besides interest rates and the balance sheet is forward guidance. And of course, the leading intellectual force behind forward guidance as a tool is Columbia's own Mike Woodford. And so not just the Fed, but many central banks have gone Woodford in their monetary policy. And although Mike's book would be a challenge for most of you, it's a challenge for me, the intuition behind forward guidance is pretty straightforward. The basic idea is that the interest rates that are really relevant to investment and housing in the economy are interest rates on longer dated loans and bonds, 5, 10, mortgages are 30 years. A lot of corporate bonds are 10 years. And so how do you, if you're the Fed, impact the economy if the rate that you directly control, the short-term interest rate, is at 0? And it's likely to be at 0 for some time. Well, what you do is you give guidance about where rates are going to be in the future. And if that guidance is credible, it influences longer-term rates today. So the key word in that sentence is credible. But if guidance is credible, then it can be viewed as a tool of policy. Now, the word forward guidance suggests that guidance either is or it isn't. But in fact, there are different flavors of forward guidance. There are several different variants. One form of calendar guidance is what I know is called calendar-based guidance. That is, the central bank says, we're going to keep rates at 0 until this date on the calendar. So here's an example of calendar date guidance from the September 2012 statement. Federal funds rate will be warranted at this level at least through mid-2015. So that's one way to try to anchor expectations about future rates. You give this calendar date. Now, financial markets love calendar date guidance because basically it's one-stop communication. Nothing's going to happen until mid-2015. But the very reason the financial markets love calendar date guidance, the Fed hated calendar date guidance because they felt, if you read Woodford or you take a PhD course in macro, your guidance should not be based on the calendar. It should be based on observable macro inputs, unemployment, inflation. So the Fed moved away from calendar date guidance, and in December 2012, it moved to an outcome-based guidance based upon macroeconomic thresholds. And so the statement then said, rates are going to stay here until at least the unemployment rate hits 6.5%, so long as inflation is well anchored. This became known as the Evans rule after Charles Evans, the president of the Chicago Federal Reserve Bank and a world-class economist, who had been lobbying for this for 3 or 4 years, and Charlie finally got his wish. So the Fed liked this, because this is really what monetary is about, policy is about. It's about unemployment and inflation. So guidance is no longer about a calendar, it's about stuff we care about. But many of us, and I would put myself in this camp, saw an immediate problem with the outcome-based guidance, in that in order to make it easy to understand, they put a lot of emphasis on one indicator of the economy that's not necessarily very reliable, and that's the unemployment rate. And in particular, the unemployment rate can fall for 2 reasons. One reason it can fall is the economy is booming, the labor market's tight. Another reason it can fall is that the labor force is shrinking because people are discouraged. And as a result, what happened when the unemployment rate hit 6.5%, which it did earlier this year, well, the Fed did not want to be in the business of signaling an imminent rate hike, so they had to change the guidance again. And they basically said, and I'm paraphrasing now, well, we don't just look at the unemployment rate, we look at 18 other indicators. And so they came up with this, we are the world, we look at everything. However, they felt a little bit nervous about that. They felt a little bit nervous about that. So what they said is, but really don't worry, because we're not going to do anything for a considerable time. So calendar date guidance made its return. As much as they hated it, they couldn't entirely get rid of it. So they didn't give an actual date, but they said rates are on hold for a considerable time. Now, at her first press conference in March of 2014, Janet Yellen was asked, how long is a considerable time? And incredibly enough, she did something no other Fed chairman has ever done in history. She gave an honest answer to that question. She said 6 months. She was then criticized for saying 6 months, and so since then she's never said 6 months again. But at least in March she said considerable time means 6 months. That's where we are. Now, the important point about quantitative easing is that even though it's been focused on the bond market, it's been buying treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, both economic theory and the empirical evidence suggest that it's impacted other asset markets. Indeed, in Ricardo's very kind introduction, he mentioned I'd started my career at Columbia. Actually, I spent the first 5 years of my career at Yale. And my office was next to James Tobin's, and so certainly it became very much part of my early experience as an economist to know about the so-called Tobin portfolio balance effect. And so what the portfolio balance model says is that if you do QE and you actually lower these rates, then it's going to encourage some investors who were buying treasuries to buy other assets. And if they do, they'll move into stocks, or they'll move into investment-grade credit, or they'll move into foreign currencies. And so by doing QE in one sector, you actually spill out into the asset market, and clearly other assets have benefited from it. Now, obviously, a lot of factors that contribute to the stock market, earnings growth, and prospects for the economy. Fed communication is very important. That's part of forward guidance. To give you an example of how important it is, there are 8 Fed meetings a year, and at each meeting there's a statement that is released, and instantly within 30 seconds, someone will send you the Microsoft Word marked up version of what are all the changes from the last meeting to the current meeting. So this was Yellen's first meeting, and so she made a lot of changes to the statement. I won't go through each one of them, but one in particular was quite important. So during Bernanke's last 6 months as chair, when he was delivering press conferences and giving speeches, he would give his personal opinion about the appropriate stance of monetary policy 3 or 4 or 5 years in the future. And what he basically said, and I'm paraphrasing, is that in my personal view, Ben Bernanke, even after the economy reaches full employment, and even after we get inflation up to our target, which is 2%, I, Ben Bernanke, think it will still be appropriate to be running a monetary policy which is more accommodative than we would have done prior to the crisis. And so, but that was Bernanke's personal opinion. So the remarkable accomplishment in Yellen's first meeting is she was actually able to get a unanimous vote of the Fed committee, the people who vote on monetary policy, to adopt that view. And I'll show you an example of that in a minute. So that's a very, very powerful form of forward guidance. It's saying that even after the economy recovers from the Great Recession, and even after we get inflation to 2, rates won't be 0, but they'll still be incredibly accommodative compared to what you would have expected based on prior performance. Bernanke was not able to get that in the statement, and Yellen was at her first meeting. So what is the state of play of Fed policy right now? We still have forward guidance. We still have considerable time. The Fed is looking at 19 different indicators of the labor market. We are tapering. We went through the taper tantrum. We can talk about that during the Q&A. The Fed is tapering, and by the end of this calendar year, they'll be done adding to their balance sheet. But importantly, the balance sheet will stay at its current level because the Fed will reinvest proceeds of bonds that are maturing or that are free to pay. The Fed is an inflation targeter. It didn't formally become an inflation targeter until January of 2012. In my work and others, we've argued that the Fed had been doing sort of a shadow version of inflation targeting for the last 20 years, but they formally became an inflation targeter in 2012. As I'll note in a moment, they now give us a lot of information about their own internal views about where the policy rate will be. And they've now clarified the exit strategy, as I said. So they've opened the door to never selling MBS. They've said they'll never sell treasuries. And they'll keep the balance sheet at its current size, at least for some time after rate hikes begin. So this is the information that the Fed provides everyone publicly 4 times a year. Each of these dots represents the personal projection of an individual meeting participant about where he or she thinks the policy rate should be at the end of each of these years. So now, each word in that description is important. First of all, these are individual projections. When the Fed's at full strength, there are 19 people around the table. The Fed now not at full strength. There are 2 vacancies, so there's 17 people around the table. So there's 17 blue dots here. Secondly, and importantly, each blue dot does not represent the forecast of that individual of where the Fed rate will be at that date. Instead, it is the answer to a different question. Where would you, Charles Plosser, or Esther George, or Bill Dudley, like the federal funds rate to be at that date under your preferred monetary policy? So what you get in the language of microeconomics, these are essentially preference orderings in individuals. They are not forecasts. So you say, well, what's the difference? Here's an important difference. If you were to ask Esther George, who's a wonderful economist and wonderful president of the Kansas City Fed, if you were to ask Esther George, where do you think the policy rate will be at the end of 2014? She would say it's going to be here. If you ask Esther George, where would you like the policy rate to be at the end of this year? She would say this. So it's an answer to a different question. So that's the first thing to note about this dot. The second thing to note about these dots is that in a companion publication that comes out the same day, the Fed is telling us that by year end 2016, it expects the economy to be at full employment, which it defines as an unemployment rate of 5.3%. It expects inflation to be 2%, which is the target. And in other words, in the language of Taylor rules or Woodford economics, then the Fed is saying that that would call appropriately for a neutral policy rate. Okay, so if the economy is at full employment and it's hitting its inflation target, then it should be at a neutral rate. And the Fed is telling us that the neutral rate in 2016, well, the median of these blue dots is 2.8%. So if inflation is 2, that means roughly translates into a real rate of interest of around 0.8%. And it's widely believed that a lot of these dots are of the district bank presidents who are not voting, and if you actually looked at the dots of the people who are voting, they would be down this distribution. So it's safe to say that the Fed is telling us that most Fed members think that even in year-end 2016, when the economy is fully employed, and when inflation's on target, that they're going to be running a policy rate with a 2 in front of it, whereas a traditional Taylor rule would say there should be a 4 in front of it. 2% real rate, 2% inflation. All right. So in the longer run, which the Fed says is 5 or 6 years in the future, the Fed sees the policy rate eventually getting to this level. And in fact, the Fed sees a lot of that gap, indeed most of that gap, closing between the year 2016 and 2017. So you may have heard of the secular stagnation thesis of Larry Summers, which postulates that in order to keep the global economy going, policymakers are going to have to keep interest rates at very low and maybe even negative real levels for some time. The Fed is saying that at least through 2016, real rates are going to be low, even on a fully employed economy, and then they begin to normalize. So obviously something that's quite important. So let me finish up my prepared remarks by just talking briefly about 3 things that certainly gain the attention of Hamilton. The Euro crisis talks about international trade negotiations with Europe and Asia and political polarization. So what does Europe have right now? Europe has the European Central Bank. And I broadly give the European Central Bank high marks for its 15-year history. I think there are some things they could do over again in 2010 and 11, but all in, a very sound institution, obviously very ably led now by Mario Draghi. So Europe has a really, really good central bank. Now I can tell you, having interacted with European officials back in the 80s and 90s, this thing was on the drawing board for 15 years, seriously. All right? They spent 15 years to get this right before it launched. The challenge in Europe is really what Europe needs now is it needs a Hamiltonian fiscal union, and it doesn't have it. It has 18 different countries with 18 different fiscal policies. And so Europe is now on the fly, until recently under duress, having to cobble together a fiscal union, a banking union, a framework. But the key point about the Eurozone is the focus in the Eurozone was getting the bank up and running, and they did. The fiscal part of it, they're still working on, and that is a challenge. What about trade? Well, I think one thing Hamilton might say is we're still negotiating. I thought we figured out trade 250 years ago. So we now have these comments of the president and David Cameron about getting to freer trade. If you actually look at average tariffs on U.S. manufacturers, I'm not a trade economist, and so I just assumed all these things were basically zero. They're not zero. They're still positive numbers. They're low, but of course, one of the things that the Washington administration had to do in Hamilton's time was to levy a tariff to raise revenue, and I guess Hamilton might have assumed that 200 plus years later that the tariffs would have been eliminated, but some of those tariffs are still around. What about politics? Well, I think you can argue that politics today is as polarized as it was in Hamilton's day. I don't have the data going back to the 1790s, but I have the data going back to the 1800s. These are measures that political scientists put together of polarization, pretty objective measures of the split between the parties in terms of their voting records in the Senate and the House. And you can see by these measures that Washington, as we all know, is very polarized now. But as Hamilton, of course, would remind us if he were here today, politics was incredibly polarized in Hamilton's day. Hamilton started the party, essentially the Federalist Party, were people who were aligned with Hamilton at the time, in direct reaction to the fear that Hamilton's party could take over the government forever. The Jeffersonian Democrats began interesting originally called the Democratic Republicans, and they had two very different governing philosophies. And indeed, the origin of political parties in this country directly ties to Hamilton and Jefferson's debates. Now, it was vicious. If you read the Chernow biography, both Hamilton Federalists and Jefferson Democrats financed newspapers, and the newspapers were regularly calling for the other to be fired or banished from existence. So it got very, very nasty. Now, Hamilton's case is interesting because Hamilton had this tie to the Bank of New York. Hamilton persuaded the Bank of New York to finance his newspaper. Jefferson didn't have a rich bank, so Jefferson actually paid for his newspaper out of the State Department budget. And as David Brooks said, today we think of our politics as being nasty and partisan, but this looks platonic compared to the vicious fighting that marked the early days of the Republic. While they were secretaries of Treasury and State, Hamilton and Jefferson waged internecine warfare that was of almost pathological intensity. Hamilton and Jefferson wrote abusive newspaper essays against the other. The Secretary of State proposed that Congress censure the Secretary of Treasury while they were both in office. So I've given you my tour of the last 200 years, the state of play today, and obviously these three issues. So what would Hamilton think if he were here today? Not bad. Statue in front of the Treasury building, one here at Columbia, and a lot of remarkable things have happened, I think, since that time. So I think at this point I will stop in my opening remarks, and I've got plenty of time for questions and hopefully some answers. But thank you very much. So I guess if you have a question, you just address the microphone. Yeah?
Technology. There we go. Wait, you did it. You did it. Don't touch a thing or you're fired. Well, let me thank you for a very comprehensive presentation of the world as we know it. The question is, when you have this austerity in Europe and what we'll call a cram down in Europe, and this cram down comes to the United States, middle class and upper middle class, meaning that there are too few good jobs as opposed to temp jobs that pay a reasonable salary, if not a living salary, that might allow you to go to Walmart or Sam's and buy some khaki pants and pay down your student debt. If this economy is going to work for people other than the 1%, how would you, if you were recruited back to Washington to take the number one job, we'll give you credit for the number two job, and how would you fix this 2% economy if you agreed with Larry Summers' idea that we live in a stagnation economy, or if you took a few thoughts from the book, The Future Doesn't Need Us? So maybe you could give us your fix for those rosy scenarios.
Wow. An excellent question, but I'm sorry to disappoint you. I don't have a fix. I think it is a very significant challenge, and I think it's one that will be with us for some time. Let me go back to one of my earlier charts, because it hints at why this is very important and also why it's very difficult. So you have this chart of all the technological innovation that we're familiar with, and sort of a basic rule of thumb that seemed to describe the world very well for decades and decades is that over long periods of time, improvements in productivity and technology would be shared widely in the economy, whether or not you look at wages or median income. And that began to break down about 15 years ago. So yeah, obviously in the middle there's been a big crisis, and there are all these factors. But I think a factor that is drawing a lot of attention, and I'm not an expert on it, is how do we think about a world in where technological change has first-order impacts on income distribution and wages for most workers, and to the extent that that is going to continue, that's going to be a very significant challenge going forward. Because up until now, technological change has been something that, broadly speaking, over long periods of time, has not had distributional consequences. What I would point out is that I know there are some who say, well, if we just looked like Norway, or we just looked like Germany, or we had this, that. It turns out that if you actually look at the data carefully, these trends are evident in essentially every rich country. So this is not just a U.S. phenomenon. It's not just a phenomenon of our two-party system. It's occurring in France. As I say, it's occurring in Scandinavia. Now, the magnitudes are different, but it does suggest to me that some of the interplay between global technology and wages and income is a more complicated one than historically was the case, and that is going to be a challenge going forward. But I don't mean to disappoint you, but that's that's really all I have on that. So next question, please.
Thank you very much, Professor, for the informative presentation. Have many questions, so I actually would like to discuss with you, like the leverage overhang, like the efficacy of QE, but I'll refrain from being greedy and just start with one that lies in the banking industry.
Yeah.
As the huge or big balance sheet model dissolved for some of the top banks, do you see a trend that the most or more profitable business, finance business, migrating to the less systemic important, less regulated part of the financial institutions? If so, should we and Hamilton be delighted, or how much should we be delighted or cautious about the financial innovation and energy moving to a rather shadow banking sector?
Well, it's a great question, and indeed, certainly one of the consequences of the post-crisis performance, whether or not you're talking Dodd-Frank or the Basel standards, is that traditional large global banks are going to be less levered. There's going to be more scrutiny on how they lend and more scrutiny on how they securitize. So to the extent that there is a demand for credit, if it's not being provided by the banks, some of that will move into the shadow system. I think that is a challenge going forward. If you look, for example, at the banking systems in much of continental Europe, there are most credit is funneled through banks. It's not funneled through the corporate bond market or funneled through the shadow banking. Indeed, in my talk, I alluded to the fact that a problem the ECB has is they'd like to buy covered bonds and asset-backed securities, which are example of shadow banking. There just aren't enough of them in Europe to buy. But certainly for a country like the U.S., that will be an issue for policymakers going forward. Most shadow banking occurs in markets directly in arm's length transactions, and it's not necessarily residing on the balance sheet of a bank. There was just a news account last week of a letter going out from the comptroller of the currency to a large international bank in the U.S. criticizing it for some of the lending it's doing in the securitized leveraged loan market. But there is no simple or one-size-fits-all answer to doing prudential oversight where a lot of the credit does move into shadow banking. I get the sense in looking at Dodd-Frank and looking at what the Stability Oversight Council has done is that their view is to be focused on making the systemically important banks as bulletproof and as safe and potentially as boring as they can. The idea that in the next crisis will be impossible to predict or to game plan, but at least if the big banks have a lot of capital, if they have a lot of liquid assets, so for example, some of the new standards would say a big bank has to have 1 month's worth of assets on the asset side of the balance sheet to withstand any sort of loss of wholesale funding. So if you have more capital, you have more liquidity and limits on how you can lend, that's going to make those banks presumably more robust. And I think that does appear to be the focus in the U.S.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Professor, for this interesting presentation. Just one question. One of the charts where you mentioned, where you showed the leverage and the rise in GDP, it clearly diverges over the last 20 years. And my question is that if you have any thoughts on why the leverage and the GDP is kind of diverging, and what happens if we going forward, considering that leverage is again building up in the system probably since 2012 as per the graph, what happens if we face another crisis? Where do the rates go from there?
Well, yeah, and in my talk, I didn't have time to go into that. I delivered a paper at a Boston Fed conference in 2010, which is now out in the Journal of Money, Credit, and Banking, and I discussed that at length. Yeah, so essentially what happened during this period is that as the private sector was levering up, that was contributing to aggregate demand. That was shifting, if you will, shifting the bias curve to the right, but it didn't produce a lot of inflation because what it did is it just produced a lot of imports. So essentially in the U.S., effective aggregate supply in the economy through imports and through the trade deficit met to match the rise in aggregate demand. Because otherwise, if the great leveraging had coincided with an increase in inflation because of excess demand relative to supply, then it would have been snuffed out a lot earlier with aggressive policy. But it didn't show up in price inflation because of the trade deficit. So, and again, the second reason was simply that it was occurring outside much of the traditional financial system, and so the Fed was not monitoring it very closely. Any more questions before we go to the reception? Well, if not, thank you all very much for coming out, and I'll be available for some time after to follow up. Thank you.